Does the Arab Spring mean al-Qaeda is losing in the Middle East? We'll talk about that next on Global Perspectives.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida.
Welcome to the Global Perspective Show. 9/11 and the response by the United States were defining moments in this nation's history. We have fought two long and costly wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We have fundamentally changed the way we view security at home, creating a new federal agency with well-known divisions such as the Transportation Security Administration. Meanwhile, the search was on for Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of the attacks. Now bin Laden is dead. Who was the man behind al-Qaeda? What does his death mean for al-Qaeda specifically and terrorism in general? Today's guest, Peter Bergen, is one of the few Westerners to have interviewed bin Laden face-to-face. He is currently CNN's national security analyst and a Schwartz Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation. Bergen has written two books, Holy War Incorporated and the Osama bin Laden I Know, which have focused our attention on the terrorism issue. Welcome to the show, Mr. Bergen.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us. Tell us how you got into the study of terrorism. You've been associated with the term now for years and years, but what was your first introduction to the issue?
When I was a student at university, a couple of friends of mine and myself went to Pakistan to do a documentary about the Afghan refugees in Pakistan living there as a result of the Soviet invasion. We went in 1983. So I got interested in Pakistan and Afghanistan because they were just interesting places. And then when the World Trade Center was attacked the first time in '93, February of '93, most of the people involved in that attack had been to Afghanistan, fought in the Afghan war, supported it in some way. And so that's when I went to Afghanistan to kind of investigate this group of people. And you know, it was clear that in the early 90s that Afghanistan was sort of a petri dish that was creating this international jihadi movement. It wasn't clear who the leader was. I hadn't heard of Osama bin Laden yet. But when his name first surfaced publicly in '96, that's when I went to my bosses at CNN and said, this guy appears to be the leader of this movement.
And so how did you come to meet bin Laden face to face? That's one of the most fascinating stories I've ever heard.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't easy. You know, he didn't wake up on the morning of September 12th saying, hey, I need to be concerned about my personal security. He and the people around him are very, you know, pretty well disciplined, quite paranoid, secretive people. They've been involved in clandestine activities for a long time. Ayman al-Zawahiri is number 2, for instance, joined a secret jihadi group in Egypt when he was 15. Now, of course, Ayman al-Zawahiri runs al-Qaeda. Bin Laden, you know, started getting involved in sort of clandestine activities supporting the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviets when he was in his early 20s. So they've been around these organizations, and they come, of course, from societies that are quite repressive. So they, you know, when we tried to meet with bin Laden, it was quite a performance involving multiple weeks of meetings with his kind of friends and colleagues in London, assuring them that we were who we were. And then we went to, you know, Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. We did a lot of waiting around. I think that the people that we were with and other people that we didn't even see were checking us out to see if we were being followed, almost certainly. That would account for why it took so long. So each step of the way, we had to sort of get through another hoop. And then finally, bin Laden's media advisor came to our hotel and looked over our gear and said, yeah, we couldn't bring any gear with us. So the interview, you know, they said they would supply a camera, they would supply a generator, they would supply everything. Because they were concerned that our gear might have a kind of electronic tracking device or some kind of, so, you know, they were, and then, you know, multiple changes of vehicle to meet bin Laden in the middle of the night, blindfolded, you know, they were very careful. They searched us very carefully. They told us to bring nothing, not even a watch. because they were so concerned about this issue about some kind of tracking device.
Did you ever worry about your safety as you were actually going
No,
through the motions?
I didn't worry about the safety because these guys had invited us for what was going to be their first television interview. It would have kind of stepped on their message somewhat if they had, used it as an opportunity to kind of do something to us, violent. And of course, Danny Pearl hadn't been murdered in Pakistan, the American journalist who was killed in Pakistan by effectively al-Qaeda in January of 2002. That was 5 years in front of us. So at that time, journalists weren't targets in that part of the world. And I just knew they wouldn't have invited us to then do something bad. I mean, I wasn't actually at all worried. I was actually mostly this was very exciting, to be honest. It was, and part of my British cameraman friend who was filming this interview was, of course, frustrated that we couldn't film a lot of the stuff that we were. It really was like going. It was the movie version of going to meet, Dr. Evil. It was, but we couldn't film any of it.
So what was the most significant impression that you got from that meeting?
My most significant impression from that meeting is, this guy is bright. He was definitely not. He was low key. The people around him seemed, a lot of them were clearly well educated because they spoke English. They seemed very organized. So the overall impression was of this guy is serious, the people around him are serious, but they're making this big claim that they're going to, they're at war with the United States. Well, how do you do that from Afghanistan? I mean, after the whole thing was over, I was like, well, that was all very interesting to declare war on the United States, but how do you really put that into practice? And we got an answer to that a year later when they blew up 2 American embassies almost simultaneously in Africa. It's hard to blow up one American embassy. It's doubly hard to blow up another one simultaneously. They did it within 9 minutes of each other. So this showed that they had an ability to mount these pretty sophisticated operations a long way from their from their base in Afghanistan. Also, it showed they had no compunction about civilian casualties, including plenty of Muslim civilians, because the bombs went off in Kenya and Tanzania, which have substantial Muslim populations.
So even though you had been through these experiences and had seen what happened in sub-Saharan Africa, were you still surprised by what happened on 9/11 itself?
Yeah, I was surprised about what happened on 9/11 in the same way that everybody else was. On the other hand, I've been spending 2 years of my life writing a book about bin Laden and al-Qaeda, which I'd completed the manuscript 10 days before 9/11. And yeah, the one thing I wasn't surprised by, I didn't need to be told, deductive logic told you it was bin Laden. No one else had the intent and the capability to do something like this. And in fact, I went back many years later to look at the CNN coverage of that day, and I was able to get on CNN, which, as you know, is a very careful news organization, and and I was able to say, it is bin Laden based on, the following. There have been a lot of, we know from the 9/11 Commission now, there was a huge volume of threat reporting coming in the summer of 2001 that something was going on. That was known at the intelligence level and also to the Bush administration. But then also just an analysis of what's out there publicly, it was blindingly obvious that something big was happening in the summer of 2001. Bin Laden alluded to it in public interviews. Certain things that the U.S. government was doing, State Department, the Department of Defense, if you just sort of noticed what they were doing, there was clearly a real concern that something was going on. And then al-Qaeda released a videotape, its first propaganda videotape in the summer of 2001, which to me really indicated something was afoot. They released this 2-hour videotape, now not at all unusual, but then very unusual, in which they were kind of laying the intellectual groundwork for why they were doing these things. So I was as surprised as anybody else. Unfortunately, I'd been warning. I'd written a 4-page letter to a friend of mine at the New York Times explaining why I thought something was coming down the pike, and he then did his own research and actually had a piece that was going to be in the New York Times on September 9th, 2001 about all this, and for complicated editing reasons, it wasn't put in the paper until after the event.
So how did your life change in the days immediately following 9/11?
Well, I got very busy to start with, but partly because I was one of the few people that actually, who wasn't in the government, who actually knew a lot about this. I also had to do a massive rewrite on the book. It was my first book, and there are a lot of problems with your first book. I mean, doesn't matter what it's about. You've got to, it always needs a major rewrite and editing, and so there was those problems. But then 9/11 came along, and then the tone of the book had to change very substantially, because I'd written it sort of as a travel log, because no one really cared about al-Qaeda. And so basically all the sort of lighter moments I just had to take out. And then, of course, this big event had happened. So I was very busy with CNN, and also very busy with rewriting this book. And I was basically not sleeping at all for a period of, like a lot of people. I mean, there were a lot of people responding to this who weren't sleeping either, responding on a government level or an intelligence level or a military level or multiple levels. So, it was a very intense time. I actually don't recall very much of it, because it was sort of a blur. I do remember going out, leaving CNN at 2 or 3 in the morning and seeing armored personnel carriers in the streets of Washington, which is pretty unusual. And it was like that for weeks. It was very quiet in Washington. I'd go out, I'd leave very late at night, and it was just almost silence in the streets of Washington.
And now, 10 years later, were your original perceptions and conclusions correct? And how do you view the threat as it has evolved over the past decade?
Well, the threat is has just dematerialized, I think, over the last 10 years. When bin Laden was killed, Wolf Blitzer on CNN asked me, straight after President Obama's speech, and he asked me, what's your reaction? And my first reaction, without even thinking about it, is the war on terror is over. And I think that's a defensible statement today. I mean, when I say the war on terror is over, I don't mean terrorism is over, because terrorism's been around for thousands of years. But what I meant is capital W, capital T as the main organizing principle of our national security policy. It's really time to move on. We're going to give bin Laden a victory in death that he didn't have in life if we're just constantly concerned about al-Qaeda and its abilities to attack us. I mean, clearly we should be concerned, the government should be concerned, but since 9/11, 17 Americans have died in jihadi terrorist attacks in America domestically, 13 at Fort Hood and 4 in other places. I mean, more Americans die in their bathtubs by much, much larger numbers every year, accidentally drowning, and we don't have an irrational fear of drowning in bathtubs. So I think that we need to kind of sort of put this in the box and where it belongs. If you can't say that that it's time to move on with the Arab Spring, in which al-Qaeda played no meaningful role, and with the death of bin Laden, the founder of al-Qaeda, I don't think, we didn't kill every Nazi to end World War II. The idea that somehow we just got to eliminate, that we've got to live in this constant state of fear and war, I think is it's just not merited by the facts. So how has my views have evolved? I mean, I think that 9/11 was such a big event that I think we mistook it for something that it kind of wasn't. I mean, it wasn't a huge strategic victory for al-Qaeda at all. They wanted to get the United States out of the Middle East. Well, that was the whole point of 9/11, was to get us out of the Middle East. Well, we then went into Afghanistan and Iraq. We have huge bases in Qatar, in Kuwait, in Bahrain. We're much more embedded in the Middle East than we were before. So from a strategic point of view, it didn't achieve its goals. And then al-Qaeda, which means the base in Arabic, lost its best base it ever had in Afghanistan. And smart people within al-Qaeda were advising bin Laden that attacking the United States was actually probably not a smart idea. And whatever their public statements after 9/11, people internally in al-Qaeda recognized that this was probably a dumb move. Well, not probably a dumb move, a very dumb move. Because they suddenly, hammer came down on them pretty hard. And they've kind of tried to regroup in Western Pakistan to some degree. They had some success there for a while. They were able to carry out the London attack, July 7th, 2005, which was the most devastating terrorist attack in British history. But that's the last time they've had a successful attack in the West. And of course, they haven't been able to attack the United States at all for a decade.
Well, tell us where you think the terrorist threat today lurks. As you said, this is something that's been with us for thousands of years. It's not going away, and
right.
Even if al-Qaeda has diminished as a danger, there are other problems out there.
Well, there are, but I mean, I would have every professional reason to sort of say that there are big problems, since it's my speciality. But the fact is that terrorism is, just terrorists have not been very successful. We have a huge national security enterprise, as you well know, where, on 9/11 there were 16 people on the no-fly list. Now there are literally thousands. On 9/11 there wasn't a TSA, which you mentioned in the introduction. Arguable form of progress that we have. 1% has made us safer. On 9/11 there wasn't a DHS, Department of Homeland Security. On 9/11 the CIA and FBI were barely talking to each other about very important issues, which is one of the reasons that the CIA not sharing important information with FBI could have perhaps averted the 9/11 catastrophe. It's a controversial matter, but the fact is that they weren't talking to each other really in the way that they are now. There are all these joint terrorism task forces around the country. I mean, just go down the list. There's so many things that have happened that make it much harder, not just for al-Qaeda, but any terrorist group. Now, you ask about other potential terrorist attacks. Anarchists, left-wing terrorists, and right-wing militia-type terrorists, that hasn't gone away. And the New America Foundation, where I work, we actually just released a database of every terrorist attack since 9/11 that had nothing to do with al-Qaeda or its ideas. And this was animal rights, environmentalists, militia, neo-Nazis. And it turns out that if a radiological bomb attack was going to happen in the United States, so-called dirty bomb, which wouldn't be a nuclear weapon, but it would still, would be a somewhat significant event. It turns out that right-wing terrorists have been much more engaged in building these weapons and trying to, detonate them since 9/11 than people coming out of the al-Qaeda sphere or anybody influenced by al-Qaeda's ideas. So, political violence is, there are many forms, and there are lots of people. There are very small numbers of people in this country who subscribe to these ideas and might do violence. And the next significant terrorist attack could well be coming out of somebody with a left-wing impulse or a right-wing impulse, rather than a sort of jihadist militant.
Now you have a new book. Tell us a little bit about that. And do you have another manuscript in the works?
Yeah, I'm trying to. Well, the manuscript in the works is The Hunt for bin Laden. So that's. But the book that I wrote, The Longest War, is a history of the war on terror since 9/11, and I finished it before the Arab Spring and bin Laden was killed, and I've updated it in a paperback version since. But the main thesis of the book, it wasn't really affected. In fact, it was kind of confirmed by the Arab Spring, which is that al-Qaeda has lost the war of ideas in the Muslim world. Polling data in every Muslim country indicates that support for suicide bombing bin Laden, al-Qaeda has been dropping like a stone because they keep killing Muslim civilians. They don't really do anything for anybody. We know what they're against, but what is their real program for stuff like unemployment? They don't have any. They won't engage in conventional politics. This is really, Muslims have been turned off. Bin Laden, really interesting fact, when bin Laden died, the protests around the Muslim world were minuscule. He'd become completely irrelevant. So the thesis of the book was the United States has made mistakes in the war on terror, but we've learned from them. Invading Iraq was sort of a dumb idea on multiple levels. It was poorly executed, but we sort of turned it around to the point where Iraq is a semi-dysfunctional Middle Eastern country which is not in the middle of a civil war, and actually, over time, particularly because of its oil reserves, may, kind of emerge as a sort of somewhat functional place. But al-Qaeda doesn't learn from its mistakes, so they embedded in their DNA is they kill any Muslim who doesn't precisely share their views. So they won't engage in conventional politics. So this has really been a problem for them over time, and so the book is kind of told from our American perspective, but also from al-Qaeda's perspective, and recounts Afghanistan, Iraq, the Battle of Tora Bora, coercive interrogations, Guantanamo, the domestic terrorism in the United States. I mean, it took me a very, very long time. I had to absorb a huge amount of, primary and secondary sources, and I interviewed hundreds of people, and I traveled to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, you name it. I went to a lot of places. So it was a major piece of work. And hopefully it's readable. I cut it in half. I wrote it way too long. I cut it in half because, it would have been 1,000 pages. No one's going to read a 1,000-page book.
Now, is this going to be your subject area for the foreseeable future, or are there other topics you'd like to?
Oh, I'd like to. I'd like to do a book on. I was contemplating a book about. Before bin Laden was killed, I was contemplating a book they're about Obama's foreign policy, basically. So, I mean, we'll see. But I have to get this other one out of the way first.
So as you look to the future, are you optimistic about how we're going to proceed in terms of these terrorist threats? Do you think we will continue to have a diminishing influence of al-Qaeda, that we'll be able to manage the other dangers because we have built up all these defenses?
Yeah, I mean, 10 years of no attack on the United States, I think, speaks for itself. I mean, by the law of averages, a terrorist recruited by al-Qaeda or a like-minded group, either recruited in Pakistan or in the Middle East or recruited here in the United States, either through the internet or self-recruited. I mean, there will be, we had Fort Hood, Texas, somebody who was essentially inspired by an al-Qaeda cleric in Yemen who's actually an American citizen who was killed, Anwar al-Awlaki. Major Nidal Hassan sort of self-recruited to this, was influenced by al-Qaeda's ideas. I mean, we will continue to have that. And a lone wolf like Major Nidal Hassan is pretty hard to stop because, he's not part of a huge network. He's not getting money from overseas. He financed it himself. So there will be things like that. But I mean, at the end of the day, is that a national security problem or is that, something less? And I think, it's not a 9/11 style event or anything close. And so there will be attacks like that in the future, but they won't completely reorientate our foreign policy as 9/11 did.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today, Mr. Bergen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.